Welcome to the world of Mark's Money Mind, coming to you once again from Longmont, Colorado. I'm your host, Mark Trautman. This educational personal finance show combines money lessons, timely topics, personal stories, and community wisdom to help listeners and viewers master their finances to enjoy a stress-free life of financial freedom. I really apologize for the big gap in publishing episodes. I was out enjoying my retirement on a trip to Norway. First, I went on an expedition cruise up to Svalbard. Look that up on a map. It's way up there in the Arctic Circle. We actually got as close as we could to the North Pole before we hit the ice sheet at 80 degrees north, 54 minutes. So quite a ways up there. I think it was around, he said around 600 and plus miles from the North Pole. So pretty far up there. And Svalbard was a beautiful island. We saw a bunch of polar bears, walruses, whales, seals, a lot of glaciers. Got to do some kayaking around the glaciers. It was just a really enjoyable trip. Lots of birds too, puffins, killiwicks, I think it is. Yeah. So then I got back to the northern part of Norway and I rented a camper van and I just cruised around there. I went to the Lofoten Islands, which are beautiful, and just kind of had a 1-week camper van tour. So that was quite the trip. It was a little bit of a lengthy period of time. And I did have internet, but I didn't have really good internet. So I wasn't going to try to record an episode and post it. And I'm not one to record a whole bunch of episodes in advance. I kind of just release them as soon as I record them. But going back to Norway, highly recommend it. If you ever get a chance to go there, I would say it should be on your list. Beautiful scenery, great people, just an all-around great time. So on today's episode, I wanted to talk about tips, not stock tips, but Treasury Inflation-Protected Securities. And there's been some discussion about them recently because the yields on them are quite attractive from a historical perspective. So I thought it would be a good time to kind of explain what they are and how you might be able to use them. And I'll share how I use them. And to understand tips in general, I think it's important to understand first how standard Treasury securities work. So Treasury securities, you'll hear them referred to as Treasury Bills, Treasury Notes, and Treasury Bonds. And there's really not much difference between them. Well, bills and notes and bonds are a little different. I'll get into that in a second. But bills mature in less than a year. They come in all different flavors, like 4-week, 6-week, 8-week, 13-week, 26-week, and 52-week. And they're offered at a discount. So when they're auctioned, they come out below face value, and then they mature at face value. And the difference between what you purchase them for and what they mature at is effectively the interest that you receive over that period of time. Now, notes and bonds. So let's first talk about notes. Those are medium-term Treasury securities, and they're from 2 to 10 years. They come in 2-year notes, 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, 10-year. And then bonds are simply just longer maturities. They mature in either 20 years or 30 years. And so that's really the difference. There's not really much difference between notes and bonds. They work the same way. They are auctioned at a principal value, $1,000, and they pay interest semi-annually, once every 6 months. And then at maturity, you get the original principal back. Pretty simple. So how do Treasury Inflation-Protected Securities, or TIPS, work? Well, they're a little bit different. They also have a fixed rate of interest, and the face value, however, is adjusted upward when inflation rises and downward if deflation occurs based on the consumer price index. So therefore, since there's kind of an inflation component to the principal side, the interest, the fixed rate of interest that they pay is lower. And that fixed rate of interest applies to the current inflation-adjusted principal amount of the bond. So let's just use a quick example. Let's say the bond came out at $1,000, and now as a result of inflation, it's worth, let's say, $1,100, hypothetically. Well, that fixed rate of interest, let's say, was 2%, would be paid on the $1,100 principal instead of the original $1,000. When the bond matures, you get back the inflation-adjusted principal amount. Or, if for some reason there was deflation during the period, you would get the original principal amount, whichever is greater. But typically, we don't see deflation. So normally, you're going to get the inflation-adjusted principal amount at maturity. So that's really how TIPS work. Like I said, the TIPS fixed rate is going to be lower than that of a comparable Treasury security with the same maturity, let's say. And let's use an example. So if you look at the 10-year Treasury today, it yields about 4.65% approximately. And the current 10-year TIP with that same 10-year maturity timeline yields about 2.34%. So the difference, which is 2.31%, is the implied inflation rate for that period of time. So basically, you can look at what is a 10-year Treasury, or any Treasury for that matter, and look at the comparable maturity TIP and see what its embedded yield is and take the difference. And that's effectively what the inflation expectation is that the market has currently for that time period. So then why would you buy a TIP instead of just buying a Treasury? Because the Treasury security is theoretically covering inflation plus a little bit of return. Why might you buy a TIP instead? And the reason is primarily that you expect inflation to potentially be higher than that embedded inflation amount. So like I said, right now, the embedded inflation on a 10-year TIP is about 2.31% relative to a standard Treasury security. So if you thought inflation might be higher than 2.31%, you might be better off with the TIP, which would adjust for inflation that you might expect to be higher. So it's not like it's going to protect you in all inflationary situations. It really is beneficial if you think inflation is going to be higher than the embedded inflation that a regular Treasury security is implying. So if your goal is to protect against uninspected inflation, then a TIP would hedge that risk. So when might you want to use a TIP instead of a Treasury security? Think of it as asset-liability matching. So you have this liability, which is a goal down the road. Let's say you want to, and I'll use a specific example for myself in a moment, but let's say there's a goal that you have that's 10 years down the road, and you want to make sure that the money is there to fund that goal when that time comes along, and you want it to be pretty principally protected. You want it to be pretty safe. Well, you could buy a 10-year Treasury, for example. You could buy a money market fund or something to that effect and be pretty confident that the principal will be there. But what about inflation? What will happen with inflation over the next 10 years? Well, that's where a TIP can really come into play, where you can say, well, in today's dollars, the goal is X, and I want to make sure that that money is available in the equivalent of today's dollars. Well, then you can buy a Treasury Inflation-Protected Security, which will adjust for any inflation that occurs between now and that goal timeline. So that's why you might want to use a Treasury Inflation-Protected Security for a goal that's specifically a goal that you definitely need to meet. It's not a goal that you're trying to say, yeah, well, it's something I want in the future, but because a lot of people will say, well, if a goal is 10 years or really far out, you could invest in equities. Well, you certainly could, but there's a risk that equity prices could go down between now and then. You might have a bear market that you don't recover from. So if it's a goal that you want to make sure that the money is there for it, that's where using a more conservative investment, such as just a standard treasury or a money market fund or a Treasury Inflation-Protected Security, might make sense. So where do I use these, or where do I think they're potentially valuable to use? There is a podcast called the Retirement and IRA Show that I have followed for many years, and I really appreciate the work that they do. And they like to look at things from a little different perspective, because what they're trying to do is talk about retirement planning, obviously, financial planning for retirees. Their approach is a little unique. It's not the standard 4% rule where the portfolio will just theoretically last for 30 years if you only take 4% out of it. But what they like to do is kind of slice it up a little bit and say, hey, one of the key factors that retirees want to cover is their base needs or base good life. In their case, they call it the minimum dignity floor, but I like to think of it as kind of base needs. And in my case, I don't think of its base needs as rice and beans, but I think of it as a level of living that is comfortable, but doesn't include all the bells and whistles. And for many people, especially people who have had a decent employment history, Social Security can go a long way to covering a good portion of that. And in a two-person household, sometimes all of that. But for many people, it doesn't cover everything. Social Security is inflation adjusted, so that's nice in that it should help keep track with those inflationary pressures on that base good life cost over time. And the other thing that's interesting is that when you think about financial planning, one of the big unknowns that you have when you're planning for retirement is how long are you going to live? So if you think about how do I cover base needs costs for the rest of my life if I don't know how long I'm going to live, well, that's an interesting conundrum. Social Security pays out until you die. So that's a nice match for that. But what if you're short? What do you do? Well, I've talked about on this podcast before, I'm pretty sure I've talked about it before, the concept of funding that differential, let's say your base needs versus Social Security, if you have it, with something called a single premium immediate annuity. I like to think of them as the index funds of annuities. Effectively, you can buy an annuity with a lump sum that will pay out for the rest of your life. And because it's immediate, it starts paying out within 13 months. Well, in my case, and I'm just going to use my case as an example. So I'm currently 60 years old, and my full Social Security will turn on when I'm 70. So that's 10 years from now. Well, I've calculated that my Social Security will not cover all of my base needs, base costs. And there's a shortfall. So then I ask myself, well, how much of my portfolio do I need to carve off to cover that shortfall for the rest of my life, no matter how long I live? Well, one way to do it is to use a single premium immediate annuity, but I don't need it for 10 years. Well, you can buy a deferred annuity, which I'm not a fan of. A deferred annuity basically means you buy it today, but it does start paying out until sometime down the road. What if I don't need it? What if I don't make it to 70? What if I change my mind? Well, really what I want to do is put some money aside to be able to buy potentially a single premium immediate annuity or allow my 70-year-old self to make that decision. Well, how much money do I put aside? And how do I fund that today securely without the worry of inflation impacts, right? And again, this is a goal that I want to make sure is funded for sure. This is base living costs. So it's not something I want to fund with an equity position or something that has more risk to it. So what I've decided to do personally, this is not investment advice, this is just what I do, is I've decided to figure out how much would I need to pay to buy a single premium immediate annuity today if I was 70 years old, which I'm not. And therefore come up with the today dollars that I would need to buy that security potentially 10 years down the road, and then therefore match it with an asset that should grow at the rate of inflation over that period of time. And then therefore 10 years from now, the money would be available to buy that in today dollars. So to me, the most logical match from an asset liability perspective is a Treasury inflation-protected security. So that's what I've done. I've effectively invested in my portfolio enough in a 10-year Treasury inflation-protected security to fund that single premium immediate annuity down the road 10 years from now for that shortfall amount that I can pretty much calculate based on what I know my Social Security would be in today dollars and what I know that single premium immediate annuity would cost in today dollars. So that's how I've chosen to use Treasury inflation-protected securities. Now, there are some people out there that have decided because the rates on these Treasury inflation-protected securities today, so for example, on a 10-year tip, they were auctioned in July, so July 15th, for maturity in 2036, so 10 years. And they're currently trading just about where they were auctioned at $1,000. So basically, you can still buy them for about $1,000 per security. And the yield on that, the fixed rate, is 2.375%. That's actually a pretty good rate. So that's on top of the inflation adjustment. So that gives you a little extra cushion against inflation. So I think it's actually a pretty good bet. And again, for my situation, for me, for my specific circumstances, you need to do your own research, of course. But previously, tips were yielding less than 2% on the fixed rate side. And now they're yielding quite a bit more over the inflation expectation. So that's kind of nice. And there's been more articles recently about tips, primarily because if you go out 20 years or 30 years, that yield is around 3%. So you're getting 3% over inflation. And I've even heard, I saw an article by Jason Zweig recently, who I highly recommend his writing. Used to work, well, I still think he works for Wall Street Journal. I get his newsletter and stuff like that. But he was talking about how he decided to basically create a ladder tips portfolio for a good portion of his retirement assets because the fact that the yields are that much higher right now, around 3% on that further out period, the 20-year, 30-year period. So it's quite intriguing. So some people have said, instead of the 4% rule, I could use tips as a big part of my decumulation portfolio, I guess you would say. Well, that's a lot of information, but I find them advantageous at today's prices for my situation in my circumstances that I outlined. But it's something I would say if you're in that kind of area of drawdown phase in retirement or pre-retirement, something definitely to check out. Check out Treasury inflation-protected securities. So let's also talk a little bit about where they should be held. Now, they have this inflation adjustment component. So it's the principal is adjusted for inflation, and it's based on the consumer price index, CPI. And that inflation adjustment from a federal taxation standpoint is considered interest. It's kind of like phantom interest. So you need to pay taxes on it even when you haven't yet received it, which is kind of a nuance of these tips. So they're really best if they are held in a tax-deferred account because then that doesn't apply. So like a tax-deferred IRA, for example. The tips, because they are Treasury securities issued by the federal government, are exempt from state and local taxes, so that's not an issue. And since these are lower growing assets, right? Treasury securities in general, fixed income, it's lower growth historically than equities, for example. It would make more sense to hold them in your traditional IRA versus your Roth IRA. You would want your growthier assets in your Roth IRA and your more conservative or fixed income in your traditional IRA because you want the growth in the IRA, in the Roth IRA so you can get that tax-free growth. And in the traditional IRA, having those fixed income assets, there's less growth, so there's less required minimum distributions down the road and so forth. So given the two options, TIPS make more sense in a traditional IRA versus a Roth IRA, and they definitely make more sense in a tax-deferred account than a taxable account for the reasons that I mentioned. So then how do you go about buying these things? You can purchase them through TreasuryDirect. So there is a website, TreasuryDirect.gov, I think it is. And that's one option of buying them. You can buy them at the auction, so when they're initially released. But that site is really clunky and it's kind of dated. It's not really keeping things simple. I like to keep my portfolio as simple as possible. So I really don't like purchasing things through TreasuryDirect, even though it's an option. TIPS can easily be purchased either at the auction or in the secondary market, which means after they've been auctioned. So for instance, that July 15th, 2036 tip, 10-year tip, well, it's a little less than 10 years now. And you can still buy it. You're just buying it from someone who already owns it. And you can easily do that through the major brokerage firms like Fidelity, Vanguard, Charles Schwab, et cetera, any of the brokerage firms. And it's pretty simple. It's something you kind of need to learn how to buy fixed income securities initially, but once you get the hang of it, it's super easy. It's very much like buying an equity. You just basically go in and you can even say, I'm interested in a tip, or I'm interested in Treasury, and I'm interested in this maturity, and it'll show you what's available. And then you can just place an order. Super easy. Now, some people might say, but aren't there exchange-traded funds or mutual funds that hold tips? Well, yeah, there are. But the challenge with owning tips or Treasury securities or any security where you're trying to match it with a specific goal that has a specific date is that mutual funds and exchange-traded funds, those securities are constantly changing in the portfolio. So there's no maturity date of the mutual fund or ETF. And it has what's called a duration, meaning that kind of like an average maturity. And that's always going to stay the same because that's the stated goal of that fund or ETF. So you're not really going to be able to match it exactly to a specific known date that you're trying to reach a goal. Now, there are some newer funds and ETFs out there that are called stated maturity ETFs, which basically do have a maturity date. So you could potentially use that as an option. And of course, any fund or ETF is going to have an expense ratio, which is going to be on top of the underlying securities or security. So I just find it easier to just buy the actual security. And then you're not paying an expense ratio and you're not seeing volatility. You're just basically buy the bond, you own it, and then it matures down the road and collect interest along the way. So I think it's pretty straightforward, and you don't necessarily need to use a fund or an ETF to do it. And the denominations are low enough, $1,000, that I think it's attainable for most people, especially ones that are in the decumulation retirement phase. $1,000 is a decent denomination for whatever you're choosing to fund. So that's kind of how tips work. You're probably potentially seeing some news about them out there just because the interest rates are pretty attractive on them right now. So they're getting a little bit more press lately. It's also an interesting thing to at least understand how they work, so you can see what is the inflation expectation that the market is implying. And that's pretty easy to do by looking at your Treasury yield curve and then subtracting out the current tips that are available at those stated maturities. And you can kind of see what different inflation expectations are along that timeline. And like I said, right now it's around 2.3%. Is the inflation expectation. When I think about it, I want to hedge against potentially worse inflation than that. That seems like a pretty low inflation figure. And if I have to choose a side, I guess you would say, is inflation going to be higher or lower? I would err personally on the side that my expectation is it might be higher than lower. So therefore, if your expectation is that inflation might be higher than the implied inflation rate, that's where a tip makes sense. If you think it's going to be lower, then you would just buy the regular Treasury security, because if the inflation rate turns out to be lower, you'd be better off with just the regular Treasury. So that's kind of how they work. Kind of interesting. They definitely have a place in portfolios for certain people. I've decided to make them part of my portfolio for the reasons I mentioned. And again, lastly, this is not an investment advice. I just kind of wanted to give you an idea how they work, because I do get some questions like, what are tips and how do they work? And should I be doing anything with this? Because I read about it in the newspaper or whatever. And so I just wanted to do a quick educational episode on what they are, how they work, how they can be used, and give an example of how I've decided to use them. And so I hope this was helpful. And again, I appreciate you guys listening out there. Sorry for the big gap in my episodes. And I'm going to try to not have big gaps like that again. But, life goes on, and I do have a lot of trips that I like to do. And this is just kind of a fun hobby for me. And it's not a money-making thing, so I'm not held accountable. I don't have a boss. And I just enjoy publishing when I think I might have something to say that people might benefit from. So I really appreciate you listening. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's show. Please click follow on your favorite podcast player or subscribe on YouTube to ensure you don't miss any future episodes. Also, please leave a rating and review for the show. This helps improve the ranking and enables other like-minded people find the content in their podcast players. I would also appreciate it if you would recommend this show to friends and family that might benefit from this content. See you next time on the Mark's Money Mind Show. Until then, make some, save and invest, live on the rest. Now for the all-important disclaimer. This show is for education and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered investment, tax, or legal advice. Please consult the appropriate advisor or advisors before implementing anything you hear on this show or any other show for that matter. While I fully intend for everything on this show to be true and accurate at the time of each recording, occasionally errors may occur. So please do your own due diligence on anything discussed.